Welcome to Demography Today lecture series, sponsored by the BBVA Foundation and organized in coordination with the LOMPOP Horizon 2020 project and the Spanish National Research Council. And we have the pleasure to have today Marketa Pechholdova, who completed the doctoral program in demography in the Faculty of Science at Charles University in Prague. Her main field of interest is mortality trends, with a special focus on cause of death. In the past, she has been working at the Max Planck Institute for Demography Research in Rostock and at INED in Paris. Since 2010, she has been a member of the Department of Demography at the University of Economics in Prague. And since January 2014, she has been employed at INED on the project Dementia, from disparities in mortality trends to future health challenges, and MODICOD, mortality divergence and cause of death, as a researcher and coordinator of the reconstruction of long-term cause-specific time series in numerous countries. She has also been coordinating the preparation of new causes of death databases, and since 2012, she has taken part in an international research network focusing on multiple causes of death. She is also working on socioeconomic differences in mortality and record linkage methodologies. And so welcome to the Spanish National Research Council. And as usual, we have around 45 minutes to 1 hour talk. And then we will open the floor for questions.
As was announced, I will speak about causes of death and their different aspects, which some of you may know, some of you might be new to you. I will not speak about trends or major theories. I will really focus more in detail on methodological issues and comparability issues, both in time and in space, and how to deal with them. So in the first part of the talk, I will speak about the comparability in time series, comparability in time. In the second part, I will introduce a new data source where you can find some harmonized data for several countries by cause of death. Then, based on the results of this database, I will present some trends and point at some possible research questions which can be drawn from a descriptive analysis on cause of death trends. And in the final stage of the talk, if I still have some time, I will speak on causes of death as an interesting extension of cause of death analysis. So, to introduce and to give a background, just a quick reminder. I'm sure you know what these terms means: pestilence and famine, receding pandemics, man-made diseases. This is very familiar. That's from a famous theory, one of the few theories in demography, the theory of epidemiological transition, postulated by Abdel Omran in the 60s. It was later extended by delayed degenerative diseases, or the age of delayed degenerative diseases, due to unexpected trends in old age mortality. In the 1990s, this theory has been reformulated in a broader concept of the so-called health transition by Julio Frank. This new concept considers the first three stages of the epidemiological transition as stage 1, where mortality is externally conditioned by infectious diseases or by how the disease is treated by some external factors such as medicine. And the stage 2, where the individuals take more of their individual responsibility in making their health better. And stage 2 starts typically, begins with cardiovascular revolution, and then it is what is happening now. Now we expect what will happen with tumor diseases, with neoplasm trends, and so on. And it depends much more on the individual responsibility than on how the medicine will progress. In any case, whatever, I will not postulate any new theory here, but I just want to stress that any potential theory must be relying on long-term, reliable and comparable trends by cause of death. And these trends have not been available for a very long time because there are several rather major issues with time comparability. So, in fact, the cause of death statistics have been collected for a very long time, and if you know the history of demography, actually demography started with cause of death study, because John Ground, his first analysis was actually causes of death. He didn't have information on age, he just had information on cause of death. So cause of death study is as old as demography is. And but surprisingly, they have been collected, well, with a questionable quality, of course, but for a very long time. And because the classification is becoming more and more detailed, it actually makes them the oldest big data we have. Because, you know, the WHO mortality database files, they are quite huge, and it's a real big data. And these data are still largely unexplored because of numerous issues with the comparability and with the size also. It's the matter of the size. Since the beginning of the 20th century, most of the existing data have been collected and classified in agreement with the International Classification of Diseases, the famous ICD, which has been revised many times. Now we are at the 10th revision. But there are, of course, some exceptions. Some countries have for long used their own classifications, which was typical for USSR and all the ex-USSR countries. Some countries adopted ICD later, which is the case of Germany, which started to use it from the 8th revision in the 1960s. Some countries have used it from the beginning, which is the US and some European countries, I would say most of the countries, where France and Czech Republic belongs, for example. In the beginning, it was planned that the ICD takes the revision would last 10 years approximately. This has been respected for quite a long time, but later on, as we see on the example of ICD-10, it only lasts 3 times more than it was anticipated, because the classification have grown so huge. It has now 12,000 of items, and the revision process has become so complex that it just takes more time. And the ICD-11 is on the way, but it's been announced several times that it will be launched, but it's still not in the final version. Given the comparability, there are 2 distinct problems. The one was illustrated with this ICD change, because every ICD change brought new definitions, new rules for selection of causes of death, and so on, and interrupts the series abruptly at the point where the revision is introduced. Another time comparability issue is related to the nature of the process of creation of the data, because there may be some changes in the preference which can take place suddenly or gradually, depends on how the system is organized. And these are also, we will see on some examples, these are rather serious issues and can be dealt with, although not in all cases. Another issue is the comparability in space, because then even if you harmonize the series for one country, then comparing it to another country, you will just find that the coding habits are so different, and you have to take them into account. So to assess the impact of these different, it starts with certification practices, because it's known that medical doctors give preference or have acquired some specifics, and these specifics, well, they vary between individuals, but there are also some country-specific patterns. And another specific are the coding systems, because some countries use centralized coding, some collect the statistics decentralized, some use computer-assisted diagnosis, some use some use totally automated coding systems, like is the case of US, and more countries are switching now to automated coding systems. But all of this creates comparability issues, and the issues are visible in the series, and they represent a big danger when you start working with data and you want to isolate one cause of death, not without looking at the others, without looking at what's happening in other countries. It's rather dangerous. It can lead to false interpretations. So the first question, the first topic is how to bridge the ICD revisions. When I speak about the problem of bridging the ICD revisions, here I'm using the example prepared by Vallin-Mesle, just to demonstrate from INED, to demonstrate the complexity of the ICD problematic. So it starts, France has one of the oldest data, one of the best collected and documented data. It starts with 1925 with ICD-3, and it all covers one group of diseases, which is heart diseases. So originally there was one code for all heart diseases, and as the classification was evolving and growing more and more complex, the causes of death were first of all made more detailed, so there are more and more codes, but also you see it's not just splitting. There are some complex exchanges because opinions changed about what is atherosclerosis, whether atherosclerosis is the real underlying cause of death we want to have, whether where heart failure, for example, should be classified, how it should be conceived, and so on. The result is that, but what we want is a so-called coherent series of deaths classified by the most recent classification, because we want to compare it back in time. So we want to reclassify all of these into the last definition. And this is the task, what we call bridging the ICD revisions. So how you can do it? There are several approaches that have been proposed in literature, ranging from simple to more complex, and one of the most straightforward approach would be use some kind of time series analysis. Just take the trends as a time series and retro project it in time, or use some technology, some methodology to deal with it. This approach finds support in literature because people are looking for simple and quick solutions. It has been published, starting from 2004 in WHO Bulletin. Then this work has been updated 10 years later, and several other papers have been proposed to deal with it, with the stated advantage that this method is time-friendly, assures smoothness, and it has a great amount of automatization, so there's very few subjectivity which would influence the result. However, it has important disadvantages because causes of death are not just numbers, and you cannot just from a trend retro-project what happened in the past, because we know that there have been breaks in the trends, there have been major discoveries, there have been abrupt progress, unexpected, and this is a big problem because future is not defined by the past and vice versa. So this definitely, it can work for shorter time, it definitely will not work for a longer time series. Another approach, maybe you might have heard of bridge coding if you ever came close to cause of death analysis. Bridge coding is an exercise done by statistical office typically, or the relevant institution at the moment, usually when they switch from one revision to another. They take a portion or a totality of death records for 1 year and code them both according to the old and to the new revision. So they get a double coding. The data look like individual data where you have each certificate coded both according to the old and the new. So you don't need any prior knowledge about which cause of death corresponds to which, because it's given by the data. And you can directly, hypothetically, compute the comparability ratios and evaluate the impact and potentially reconstruct the time series. But unexpectedly, this approach, based on what was tested, has several rather important disadvantages. So the first one is you have to have the bridge coding, and the bridge coding is expensive, and it's a laborious task, and it's largely unavailable. If it's available, it comes in a small sample, and the small sample would not cover all the causes of death, especially when you want to split them by age and sex and go into further details. You just will not have enough significance to be able to apply it and to project it backwards also. The bridge coding is by far is not universal. It only applies to the one country, and in extreme to 1 year, if you want to go to extreme. So you have to make assumptions that the same distribution would be valid if you perform the bridge coding every single year from now. Because in bridge coding, typically what happens is that everything links with everything. Then there is some effect of black box. If you use it directly, you don't really know what's happening in the end. So you have very little control. And you still need to do some validation because it's still not assured that this will be automatic. So about bridge coding. So the third method, the correspondence-based method, or the method by Mele, Vallin, or Vallin-Mesle, whatever, it's been known, it's been here for years. It's been developed for France, and in the project that Diego mentioned, we were working quite a lot on how to make this method, how to automatize it, and how to bring some element of objectivity by using, we tried to use some statistical and computational methods to make the task more standard. But in spite of all the efforts, it still requires a lot of input in terms of first knowledge, because you have to determine what are the correspondences. It's based on comparing the content. So first is the medical content, and the second one is the statistical content. So first you assume that the items which have the same definition would have the same statistical content, and then you check if it's so in reality. So the method is stepwise. So you make the first assumptions on correspondences, then you check, and you progress in steps. And a big advantage is also that we have enlarged quite importantly the number of countries for which the work has been done, and this enriches the knowledge base, because you can learn from one experience in one country, you can learn a lot about the others. Typically, because the issues, they don't come unexpectedly, they appear typically in given types of causes of death. Disadvantages, of course, it's very laborious, and there's still some element of subjectivity, but it's quite minimal, because I mean, if two people do the same job, because it's based on the definitions and on statistics, it will not lead to identical but not very different results. So when we say reconstructed time series, what do we mean? We mean that for every cause of death, we made a small group, which we call association, which comprises like a group of diseases which are interlinked somehow, and this is how they look classified to the old and to the new revisions in a row. And then we do the recomputation, we define what belongs to which in which proportion, and we obtain smooth trends according to the most recent revision. Yeah. So this is not time series. You know, it can keep, if there are breaks in the data, it will keep them. And of course, the work is more precise the more detail you work with, because it allows you to separate distinct trends and not mix everything with everything. So these are the reconstructed time series by the a posteriori or correspondence-based method. So as I mentioned, the classification changes by far it's not the only issue in comparability. You can have a change in the coding, which can appear at any time. It can be sudden or gradual. This is one of the many examples I have. This is the Czech Republic data, 1968 onwards, and in the middle of 70s, there has been, at one day, someone came up with the idea that the definition for acute myocardial infarction should be changed to include that myocardial infarction should be less than 6 weeks from the initial complaint about health, or from the initial contact with the doctor, and it resulted in this huge change and it corresponds with the increase of chronic ischemic heart disease, because if the myocardial infarction was older than 6 weeks, it would go to chronic. This is okay. If you see it like this, you see it immediately, there's a problem, and in this case you can just correct it. The problem is what many researchers do, they take one time point, they take just chronic ischemic heart disease and draw a conclusion. Here you would draw a conclusion how the mortality from ischemic heart disease improved in the Czech Republic. It was a miracle, but in fact it's an artifact, of course. And I'm showing this because this is one of the biggest causes of death. So it's not a minor thing. It's a big thing, and even with the big things, you have to be careful and look always at some comparison. Another example is my favorite example of septicemia, and I've been working mostly on the 3 countries: France, West Germany, and Czech Republic, and this is what happened to septicemia in the 3 countries, and all of them. From 68 to, ICD-10, the septicemia increased, but in a different way. In France, which adopted automated coding, the increase was immediate, because the automated coding system immediately takes into account the new coding rules. And this indicates that this is actually a matter of coding, or at least in part, because you don't know if all of it or just part of it. The same happened in the Czech Republic and West Germany, but in a different pace. The Czech Republic uses centralized manual coding, so there's one person who sits at the statistical office and selects cause of death. Oh, it was the case. Now they switched to automated also. And Germany uses decentralized coding, so they have regional health offices which select underlying cause of death, and then this is sent to the central office, the Statistisches Bundesamt, which compiles the statistics. And you can see that in Germany the change was more gradual, because you have more coders, they adopt slowly, and there is some variability. In Czech Republic it was more rapid. It came actually after they adopted some coding improvement program. So this is what can happen, and it has very little to do with some real trend, or at least you don't know how much it is connected with a real trend. What is problematic with septicemia is that it's placed in a chapter of infectious diseases, and infectious diseases are one of the best defined diseases in the classifications. So all of the trends are rather clear. This is the chapter of infectious diseases plotted as cumulative death rates, cumulative standardized death rate. So all the countries, the 3 countries, males, females, there have been a decline in infectious diseases, which was driven by tuberculosis. Since the 60s, the declines were still important with tuberculosis. Then in France, there was an epidemic of HIV. In Germany also. In Czech Republic, there wasn't. And now we have an epidemic of sepsis. Yeah, and why is it? Because you can see the sepsis is now the leading infectious disease. And in fact, it's not an infectious disease, it's an end-stage condition. It's not an infection you catch from somewhere, like virus or something. So it's very different in character from other infectious disease, and it's the leading disease of the infectious disease chapter. So another danger is if you look, which is another common practice, you just look at the chapters as they are without looking what's inside. And again, you draw wrong conclusions. That there has been, in this case, there's been really worsening in infectious diseases, and you don't know how much of it is an artifact, and how much of it is true. Last point on comparability and the coding issues is circulatory diseases. Circulatory diseases are, in some countries, they make up to 50% of all the mortality. They are very important causes of death. And very often, for example, in the concept of avoidable mortality, just ischemic heart disease is taken from the whole chapter. So they are often taken, one disease, ischemic heart disease typically, or cerebrovascular diseases. And this is what happens when you compare the 3 countries, France, Czech Republic, and Germany. You expect that France will have the lowest circulatory disease standardized rate. This is okay. It's true for acute myocardial infarction and chronic ischemic heart disease, at least. If you look at other diseases in the chapter, like heart failure or atherosclerosis, among which heart failure is particularly high, it's like half, it makes half of the chronic ischemic heart disease in scale. You see that in France actually has much higher death rate from heart failure than Czech Republic. So this does not go in line with your expectations. If you look at atherosclerosis, you see no improvement in the Czech Republic, in spite of there are large improvements in other causes of death. So what's happening here? The thing is, we don't know. What's happening is the changes in the coding, changes in certification, changes in the opinions on how things should be selected, changes in completeness of the certificates. We don't know exactly what's going on. We know that the statistics by individual categories of heart diseases or circulatory diseases are unreliable and should always be considered as a totality. Never isolate one circulatory disease from another, because they contain what is called the garbage codes. The garbage codes is some fashionable term for specific, for usual suspects, causes of death which are ill-defined or they are just unspecific in terms of the content. They are some problematic definition in the ICD coding rules or classification itself. And heart failure and atherosclerosis is one of the two prominent garbage codes. So to summarize, part 2, when you reconstruct time series, there are several steps to take. First, you have to build the correspondence table saying which items correspond to each other medically. Second, you have to put them in associations, check for continuity within these associations, modify if necessary, compute the coefficients, which is the core, it's the computational core of the method. This is where you redistribute actually the series. Then check, modify if needed, look for other breaks, like the breaks not induced by the classification but by the coding, and do what are called posteriori corrections. And some of these steps, those ones, we managed to automatize, and some of them we didn't. So even after, in the frame of this project I mentioned, we put lots of efforts in automatization. Still, there is some important input. So, to summarize, ICD revisions can be overcome. We've seen it numerous times that there are solutions if they are reconstructed carefully with respect to medical and statistical content. We can also control for some, but not all, of the coding-related issues. And we have to be careful about garbage codes, because they are typically the codes which make problems in comparability. And finally, to understand more the substance and causes of death, because it's better to have more countries, because you see a trend in one country, you don't know if it's too much, if it's too low, just don't know if the trend is good or if the trend is bad. So here I come to the second part of the talk, which introduces a new database on causes of death. So we set up this database 1 year ago. It's quite new. It's a collaborative project between Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research and Institut National d'Études Démographiques at INED. And it is one of the main results of the two research projects mentioned in the introduction, the DUMOSHA and MODICODE. The database provides all the existing series by causes of death, which up to now have been finalized and put online. The reconstruction works have been coordinated, so they have been separate works by country specialists, but we met regularly to consult the results, to exchange the methodologies and to exchange the tools. It was coordinated by Franz Miller, Jacques Vallin and myself. And apart from, as I described, bridging the ICD revisions, the database also controls for some other issues like under-registration of infant mortality or changes in the definitions of infant mortality. Just to give a hint on what is the content of the database, so we have had to decide what kind of detail we will publish. So we published the most detail, which is called the full list, which is either it's the full ICD or it's the full national list, because some countries do not use the full ICD. Then we set up a universal intermediate list, which is a list of 100 causes, which should be available for all the countries, except Belarus, whose national list was just not compatible with this intermediate list. And then we have a short list, which is basically ICD chapters. For all of these lists, we provide death counts, but also indicators, such as age-specific death rates, crude death rates, but also age-standardized death rates, to both of the standards, the old European standard and the new European standard from 2013, and we provide all ages and specific age groups. So just if you need, you don't need to compute it yourself, because it's quite a routine work and so on. So what I think is the great add-on of this database is the background and documentation, because all the series and the data have been carefully documented. And you find there the information which is very hard to find anywhere, because statistical offices very rarely keep track of what has been decided, when the rules have been changed, what has happened, how the causes of death are collected, how they were collected some years ago, when did the change come, and so on. All of these informations, they affect the causes of death, and they are very hard to find. So we are very glad to have them in the background and documentation files, which it's an analogy to, you certainly work with human mortality database or human fertility database. So the background and documentation files have a standardized structure. They give the data sources, they point at some issues, they provide information about classifications, coding system, and also the reconstruction process, because it's not just taking the data and putting them somewhere. There is some scientific input, so it's all documented here. And of course, with all is referenced and annexes are given. When I spoke about it as an advantage, and I really believe it is an advantage that this database contains corrected infant mortality rates. This issue is pertinent particularly in the countries of ex-USSR, which have undergone several definitions of live birth. And we know that defining or any restriction on definition of live birth may result with a decrease in infant mortality. So if you exclude the infants at highest risks with the lowest birth weights, you artificially lower your infant mortality. And this is what was happening in Russia and other post-Soviet countries, which were changing their definitions, and the published. So taking the case of Russia, the published data would look like this, and this is what is in the HMD. But in fact, the data can be corrected for changes in definitions, and going back to 60s, the infant mortality was double from what has been published, if you take into account the changes in the definition. Similar for Belarus, Romania, Moldova, where the differences were not that high, but just we believe this is the best estimate of infant mortality you can have. So main thing, the database can be found at this website. The data are free of charge. You just have to register free of charge. You obtain a password which you can keep forever. Then the database, the interface of the database looks like this. You see, it's a bit similar to what you know from the other Max Planck databases. In the front page, you have the list of the countries, some information on the database, research team acknowledgements, so on. Research team just mentioned, we have two directors. Dmitry Zhdanov is the director from the side of Max Planck. Vallin-Mesle is the director from the side of INET, and there's a core team. And there are country specialists. As I said, that it's this important work has been done by always a team or a person who is responsible for that. So for every country you can find the list of the persons you can eventually write to if you have any question or anything. So now how the site for individual country look like. This is the case for Russia. So you, as I said, you have death counts, death rates, standardized death rates, and additionally we provide ill-defined death rates. We have the periods, the 3 types of the list. Here you will find the background documentation data and the lists themselves with text diagnosis, because in the data you just have the numbers of the diagnosis. Yeah, so you can also download summary files by country or by indicator as a zip for easier access, and you can work with these data. So to summarize the part on database, we have in the frame of research projects, we have reconstructed series for numerous countries and put them online as a database. And we believe that this database contains the best practice estimates on past cost-specific trends, because unlike for any other database, it has been controlled for the ICD changes, it has been controlled for data quality issues, for the most important ones. It has been controlled for the major coding issues, for comparability issues, and so on. We provide data as well as summary indicators, and database still is in progress because for some countries we have encountered some unexpected problems. They all have to do things with changes in the collection systems. So in France they changed to automated coding system. In Japan they introduced a new death certificate 1 year before they changed to ICD-10. In Germany there has been a great change when the German Republic reunited, as East Germany passed to the West German coding systems, and there have been incredible jumps. So there are always good reasons for why some countries are delayed. So in the third part of the talk, I will give an overview how it looks like when you look at the database. So I will use graphs with many lines, but don't be scared too much. It's three-letter abbreviations for the countries. I try to make there a little bit of system by plotting ex-USSR in shades of red, Central European, Czech Republic and Poland in green, the Baltic countries in orange and yellow, and the Western countries in the shades of blue, cold colors. So this is male. There will always be males on this side and females on that side. So this is the total, this is the all-cause standardized death rate according to the new standard population. And we can see, well, we can focus here at the east-west divergence, east-west mortality gap. And there's some very clear distinction between the countries, which is something you would expect probably. The Western countries being much lower on mortality than the Eastern countries, and the countries of the former ex-USSR being at the top, recovering from a great crisis related to the breakdown of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The same graduation, but less pronounced, as can be seen in females. And the beauty of this is that by all of this we have cause of death, so we can cover all these trends and disentangle them by cause of death. And this is, I will not make a systematic analysis, I will just go through individual causes and propose some research questions and topics which can be studied using this database as a starting point, or using this data as a first entry data. So when you look at tuberculosis, I told you, and you've seen it on this graph on infectious diseases, that tuberculosis was responsible for most of the decline in infectious diseases since the 1970s. Has been the case for all countries except the countries of Soviet Union, where tuberculosis re-emerged in the after the collapse. There's been a crisis of tuberculosis, which seems is now there is a return to some better levels, but this is something that's documented by the data. Another infectious disease which you can look at is the HIV disease. You know, the main epidemic of HIV took place in the end of the 80s in countries like France. Well, we still don't have the old data for France here, and in Western countries. And now in Western countries, it's just down where it was, more or less, because of the efficient treatment and because of as people pay more attention. But again, it's been on the rise, on an important rise in the Eastern Europe, in the countries of the post-Soviet countries, and it's still taking place now. And so it is some challenge for the health systems, the HIV. Another, when you look at some cancers, the cancer of stomach, which is a very good indicator of some general health progress, is, as you would expect, is much lower in the Western countries, and it's actually gradual. But there's an exception, which is Japan. Japan has the highest rate of cancer of stomach, and it's discussed why. And it's an example. You can put the research question and make more investigation into why Japan has the highest rates of stomach cancer in the world, probably. Another thing which you can look at is a colorectal cancer. Colorectal cancer is rather important. It's a big threat in many countries, related to lifestyle, to abundant lifestyle, and colorectal cancer, for which efficient screening exists and has been on for years in developed countries, is on decline in these countries for years, and started to decline in Czech Republic, which was for long it was the leading place in the world. Well, now I found that now it's Slovakia, the leading place for stomach for colorectal cancer. So there is some clear difference between the trend in the West and in countries which adopt screening programs, and again at the post-Soviet countries, where we still observe an increase. And yeah, I think this is a good research question. Can make a research question. Then, of course, smoking, the most famous risk factor for cancer, and probably by far the most important factor for smoking cancer, for lung cancer. Well, we can see that there is clearly a story of an epidemic, which it's not surprising. We know that lung cancer in males was on the rise and that now it declines. It happens with a delay, with a little bit of delay. It happened in Central Europe, and it happened actually also in the countries of post-Soviet, of ex-USSR. So this is one case where the story is common, the timing differs, but again can be a question, especially in combination with females, because females, they try to catch up on males recently, because it is said that males quit smoking, females they start, and the situation looks a bit different here, because here the Western countries tend to be the lowest, and here the Western countries are the highest. Like the female lung cancer is the highest in US and UK, and is on the rise anywhere else. Another thing which I think is an important health issue is dementia, and well, the trend doesn't look very nice, doesn't look very comparative. What you see here is a huge increase in the Western countries, and just like nothing happening in Eastern countries. And it can be that dementia, or it is partially, it's more and more recognized as cause of death. But similar thing happens for Alzheimer's disease, which is kind of getting more and more popular as a diagnosis. Yeah, sure, part of it is the recognition, part of it is certification, but there is part of it is real because the populations are aging, and dementia is just a disease of aging. It's the cost for the survival. And it's a point to investigate, and I will investigate on it a bit later in the talk. And we can also look at health performance assessment. It can be operationalized by effectiveness of screening programs. We can have a look at 2 cancer types which are very, very sensitive to screening, to early detection. It's the cancer of cervix. You can see the cluster of Western countries with very low mortality, and very good distinction of Eastern countries with positive trends in Central Europe again, and stagnating trends in the post-Soviet countries. And cancer of prostate, again, you see a similar thing as with colorectal cancer, because for prostate you have an efficient screening as well, and well, the populations in Western countries seems to be more compliant with or more sensitive to prostate cancer screening than people in the East, where it's on the rise still. And finally, well, so this looked nice so far. Looked like we could find research questions and draw stories from that. But then there are things which look much less clear. And one of them is this case of septicemia. We've seen it with 3 countries. Now we've seen it with 16 countries. And again, it doesn't look very informative, because it's high in the West, low in the East, and it has very high yearly fluctuation. You don't know what's going on really, and moreover, you don't even know what sepsis is as a cause of death, because it's often a terminal stage condition for people who are chronically impaired. They end up dying with pneumonia and sepsis in hospital. So you don't know how much of it is real mortality trend, how much of it is a coding artifact. And malnutrition, again, it's a symptom, it's not a cause of death, it's very rarely a cause of death. On the other side, it's a symptom of many diseases like dementia, cancer, any diseases where your mobility is reduced, where you just can't take care of yourself. The first thing is your nutritional status goes down, but the thing is, it should not be coded as a cause of death, because it's cause of death, the underlying cause of death, the idea of it is to select the thing which started all the chain, and malnutrition is somewhere on the chain, but it's not the cause. And there's very little reason why malnutrition would be so high in France, for example, and why France would be the only country with the highest rate for malnutrition. So just to summarize, just be careful with with the interpretations, with the data. And what we've seen from the trends is that causes of death, I believe, they have a great potential in explaining the international trends, disparities, and differences. However, again, repeat, be careful with some codes. And typically, what is called the garbage codes, well, malnutrition is part of it, sepsis is a part of it, atherosclerosis and things like that. So be careful. Another thing is knowing that we think that national data producers should be warned or should receive some feedback on, well, look, in your country you have the highest malnutrition rate in the world. There's something could be done about this selection and so on. But you know, this is a wish, and the question is what kind of actions can actually in reality be taken to do something with that. And I'm switching to the last part of the talk, which will propose or speak about a new research line, well, relatively new compared with the underlying cause of death, which I said are relatively old sources of data, and these are the multiple causes of death. Multiple causes of death in general reflect more than a single cause of death statistics, that death is a complex process. It's not, even though there is one disease which, if it could be avoided, the person would probably be still alive, it's less and less true in old populations. So in elderly population, the concept of underlying cause of death is, I think, a little bit less relevant than in young populations, where it can really be traced to a few single causes of death. Another problem with underlying cause of death statistics is that because they always seek the most serious cause of death, the most lethal one, the lethal ones are overestimated, and we have very little information about the other ones. And think about dementia, like this one. Dementia is not the most lethal disease, but it's the most expensive on the list of diagnoses, for sure. Yeah. So there are reasons why to be interested in multiple causes of death, and these reasons are not just hypothetical research reasons, but very practical. And compared to underlying cause of death data, multiple cause of death data are even more complex source, because they contain everything that has been recorded for the person at the moment of death. And because many deaths occur in hospital, the information is actually quite good, because for some individuals you can have more than 20 records, more than 20 diseases at the moment of death, which is an amount of information to be dealt with. So go to the basics. A death certificate. So every death is recorded on a death certificate, which is ideally standardized by the WHO recommendation. WHO recommends to put 4 lines in the death certificate with underlying cause of death at line D. The certificate has 2 parts. Part 1, which should contain the chain of the diseases which lead to death, starting with the disease on line D, going up. Here is the immediate cause of death, so the one that caused the death in the last moment. And part 2 is other significant conditions, so conditions which are present but are unrelated to the main chain of death, of the pathological process. This is an example how a certificate would look when it's filled. So this person's underlying cause of death is a lung cancer or the bronchial cancer, which went to develop into metastasis in brain, and finally the metastasis have caused the brain bleeding. This was the main chain. This was what killed the person. But apart from that, the person also suffered for diabetes. And in the ideal case, you have also times. Doctors record times, which is helpful when you select how the disease was severe and how was the chain was. So the diabetes, he suffered for 10 years, and 2 years ago he developed this cancer, and then it went quickly, like 3 months from metastasis to the death. So when you have multiple causes of death, you have all that the doctors entered on the certificate, and you can look at the process, not just one cause, but the process, and you can look at comorbidity, which I think is a very interesting question. So I've done some analyses on multiple causes of death, and I will give 2 examples which I believe are interesting. So I worked on dementia and sepsis. Why I worked on sepsis? Well, dementia is one of the major future health threats. You know that estimates are quite pessimistic, saying that the number of people suffering from dementia will double, which goes in line with the aging itself, with the aging process, which is unavoidable. It will happen. And dementia, why is it such a threat? Because it has a very high disability potential, and as I say, it's very expensive, because these people need permanent care, and they need health and social assistance. and it takes 5 years for dementia to, it can take very long just to live with dementia. And another property of dementia is that its condition, it partially goes with age. It's age-related. And a bad thing is there is no causal treatment, at least not for the primary dementias, because you have primary dementias which stem from neurological damage or some neurological condition like Alzheimer's disease, and you have secondary dementias which develop as a consequence of a primary disease, typically cerebrovascular condition or thyroid condition or some other disease, and these dementias can be reverted if the primary condition is treated, but they are minor, of course. And another topic I treated with multiple causes is the sepsis, because I was always meeting sepsis and I just wanted to find out what's going on with sepsis and whether multiple cause analysis can shed more light into this topic of sepsis. And so I conducted an analysis and I found out I was not the only one who was interested in sepsis, and sepsis actually, apart from being a garbage code, from the point of view of statistic, it is a recognized medical issue in acute care units, because, as I said, sepsis is an end-stage condition. It affects weakened individuals, immunocompromised. Sepsis is a generalized infection of your body, which is develop a response which the body cannot handle, and then you die. And another thing related to sepsis is that sepsis occurs in hospitals, and very well in a non-negligible number of cases in sepsis you have resistant bacteria involved, or resistant microorganisms, and this is rather a big issue in hospital care of today. So it has been recognized, however, that if you stick to some clinical guidelines, the survival of the sepsis can increase, and if the patient survives the sepsis, it actually survives this immediately threatening condition. His underlying condition will let him live for years. So this is another use of multiple causes of death, because now the survival does not depend only on the underlying cause of death, which can be treated, but the other causes of death which attach, like sepsis and malnutrition, they pay more and more in the survival in these multiple comorbid individuals. So this is why I think it matters, and it can help, it can clarify some mortality trends using multiple causes of death. So I've shown this before, the trends in dementia. International, I will focus on the Czech Republic because I work with data on the Czech Republic. So what happened with dementia? We see an international comparison. The Czech Republic, it looks like a mess. There was no dementia, and suddenly in 2011, which coincides with introduction of automated coding system, by the way, we have this increase. And we have a similar thing with Alzheimer's disease. So at the first sight, the underlying cause of death statistic doesn't look very trustful. It changes when you look at multiple causes of death. So here, because I had multiple causes of death only since 1998, I will plot the standardized rate, what we've seen, underlying cause of death, from nothing to something in 1 year. And I also took total mentions. So I had all the causes on the certificate, so I looked at all the mentions where all the deaths where dementia, this is for non-Alzheimer's dementia, was mentioned. And that's much more. It's actually way much more than here. And there is no jump, which is more important. So you can see, this is the proof that this is really due to coding, because the new coding system just gives more preference to dementia if it's present on the certificate. And the third thing I plot is the ratio of these two. It's the SRMU, standardized rate mortality, multiple to underlying. So it's the ratio between multiple and underlying, and it went from 80 to something like 5. meaning that dementia was 80 times underestimated before, and now it's just 5 times. So we can clarify with multiple causes. We can clarify the trends. This was non-Alzheimer. This is for Alzheimer. We've seen this strange thing. There was some instructions in the coding. Then the automated coding went up again, but nothing happened to multiple cause of death trend. You know, so this, I think this speaks for itself. You know, so and I think this is more real. This is the trend that can be trusted much more than the trend for underlying cause of death. So it's typically an example of a cause of death where multiple causes of death are definitely more relevant than underlying cause of death, because the disease is not lethal. This is when you look at 1 year, 2011, the last year, by age. So as I said, dementia is an age-dependent condition. It increases exponentially with age. Alzheimer's diseases is believed to be the most frequent type of dementia, but according to this data, it's not. It's the non-Alzheimer's dementia, which is much more prevalent, speaking about Czech Republic. And it's also much more underestimated, which is okay, because the Alzheimer is like the primary dementia, and the non-Alzheimer includes secondary dementia. So this is not really, I'm not saying this is a problem, but if you want to estimate the burden of dementia, of course you better be interested in the maximum number of what you can get, and the difference between underlying and multiple is rather big. Another field of application for multiple causes of death are studies of comorbidity. So comorbidity is the coexistence of several diseases. In this certificate, the question is how the disease of our interest is associated with others. So here I computed an association strength indicator, which is an indicator, you can find it in the literature. It quantifies the strength of the link between 2 causes of death on one death certificate. And so this is the value of the association indicator. The higher the indicator, the stronger the association. And I compared non-Alzheimer and Alzheimer dementias and their comorbidity. So one finding is they share a lot of common comorbidity. So both of them coexist on the certificate with pneumonia and other diseases of genitourinary system, which typically would be something like renal failure, another end-stage condition. You also have diseases of the skin and subcutaneous tissue for both of them. And here the prominent cause is decubitus. It's a condition which you develop when you're immobilized and lie on a bed and develop a skin condition. And malnutrition, of course. All of these characteristics, they go with dementia, and they all point to one thing. Another important associations are with other mental disorders, other neural diseases. And then what they differ is the non-Alzheimer dementia are associated with cerebrovascular diseases, which cause dementia, with disorders of thyroid gland cause dementia also, and for some reason with tuberculosis. I don't know why. And the Alzheimer disease, surprisingly, is associated with malignant neoplasms of the skin, but also, I I haven't found the support in literature for this finding. Then the last thing, going to sepsis, again, this graph pointing at Czech Republic. We've seen that it increased in many countries. It's higher in the West. It increased in the Czech Republic. This is the graph showing, again, the underlying cause of death. It increases. The multiple causes of death, you can see, much higher, but the increase is also more important than the one for underlying cause of death. And the amount of underestimation, the ratio, which goes down, meaning that the underestimation gets lower. meaning that the underlying cause of death reflects more and more what is going on in the death certificate favoring dementia. And I done a research on that, this research is driven by older people. So it is the question of population aging, of survival to higher ages, of prevalence of chronic conditions which end in septicemia, and the fact that septicemia increases in more and more cases of deaths, and it's almost all of them are hospital deaths. It means there is some potential for treating sepsis and saving the life, not by treating the underlying condition, but by treating this immediate condition. And it is, I concluded we better need some clinical guidelines for sepsis, and I found support in literature for that. I found that no such guidelines exist, and sepsis is not treated as efficiently as it could be in the Czech Republic. When you look at associations, because I will not go through all of it, but I performed a similar analysis of comorbidity using the association strength, and here I plotted the cases with the diseases with the strongest association, and of course in absolute terms most patients who develop sepsis are the ones who suffer from circulatory or cancer disease, because they are just most. But if you look at this indicator is a relativized indicator of association. If you look at this indicator, then most patients who end up with sepsis are those who have some ongoing infection or skin disease or kidney disease or musculoskeletal disease. So again, in these patients, the doctor should be more careful and more prepared to treat for the onset of sepsis. So to summarize the last part of the talk, multiple causes of death, I believe, make a valuable extension to classical approach using underlying cause of death. And you can see that many things make much more sense if you use multiple causes of death. What looks like a garbage code actually looks like something which has an information inside if multiple causes of death are added. They can understand some mysterious changes in the underlying cause of death statistics and explain and actually eventually serve as a correction factor. We can estimate the misclassification rate and so on. In the aging populations where I believe the underlying cause of death is becoming less relevant, they can provide a more complex picture, including non-lethal conditions, end-stage diseases, and symptoms, which become more present as population ages. And they contain information about comorbidity, which is not anywhere else. There is no other source which could be used, because for sample surveys, the conditions are self-reported or they are limited to very large groups, or just a question of yes and no, and it's I can't think of any other source which could provide similar information. So that's all. Thank you for your attention.